The message arrived at 3rd Army Headquarters on a morning in March of 1945, and what it contained was an instruction that whoever drafted it had almost certainly considered reasonable. Bypass Trier. The city would require 4 divisions to capture. Do not commit forces to the assault. Continue the advance. The logic behind it was sound enough in the abstract. Trier was a significant German city, the oldest city in Germany, in fact, with Roman walls that had survived 1,700 years, and a population and an infrastructure and a defensive capacity that the planners at SHAEF had calculated in the only way planners at that level can calculate things, which is to say, from above and in advance, using historical data and standard assumptions about what it takes to reduce a defended urban area. 4 divisions. The math was the math. The problem with the message was not the math. The problem was the timing. Patton read the order. Then he composed his reply. The reply was 12 words long. 12 words that reached back through the command structure and produced a silence that lasted, by some accounts, nearly a full minute before anyone in the receiving room said anything. What he wrote was this: "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back? If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button." Let me back up a second, because the 12 words require context to carry their full weight, and the context begins with the 3rd Army's position in March of 1945. By early March of 1945, Patton's 3rd Army had been in continuous operation since August. It had broken through at Avranches, swept across France at a speed that had become one of the defining achievements of the Western Campaign, turned 90 degrees in 72 hours to relieve the Ardennes crisis, and was now driving east and north into Germany in the final push of a war that everyone in the command structure knew was approaching its conclusion. The 3rd Army was moving faster than most armies in the history of armored warfare. It was also, by March of 1945, moving faster than the orders above it could reliably track. This is the specific operational context that produced the 12 words. A gap between the pace at which Patton's army operated and the pace at which the command structures above him could generate orders to govern what it was doing. By the time an order arrived from SHAEF, it was sometimes addressing a situation that no longer existed, because the 3rd Army had already moved the situation forward. Now, here's the thing. The order to bypass Trier was not issued in bad faith. SHAEF was doing what Strategic Headquarters does, which is to manage the operational picture across the entire Allied advance and allocate resources according to priorities established at levels above any individual army. The instruction to bypass Trier reflected a calculation that the city was not worth 4 divisions in the final weeks of the war, that the force could be better used pushing east than bleeding against urban defenses. This was a legitimate military judgment. The problem with legitimate military judgments is that they are made in advance and on the basis of assumptions that the situation on the ground is under no obligation to honor. Trier, the oldest city in Germany, founded by the Romans in the 1st century before the Common Era, situated on the Moselle River at the point where it had served as a crossing point for 2,000 years. The Romans called it Augusta Treverorum, and built there the Porta Nigra, the Black Gate, which was still standing in March of 1945 and is still standing now. Trier had been a capital of the Roman Empire at its height, a seat of bishops and archbishops for 15 centuries, a city whose walls and gates and basilica had survived the fall of Rome and the migrations of the peoples who came after and the various wars that had moved through the Moselle Valley in the centuries since. It was now, in the spring of 1945, a military objective on the map of the 3rd Army's advance. SHAEF's planners had looked at Trier and calculated 4 divisions. 4 divisions was a reasonable estimate for the reduction of a significant German city in what was still, technically, an active war zone. German cities had been defended with considerable ferocity throughout the campaign, and there was no particular reason to assume that Trier would be different. Picture it: the planning room at SHAEF, the maps, the order of battle, the allocation of forces across the entire Allied advance. A city on the Moselle requiring 4 divisions, and 4 divisions being needed elsewhere, and the instruction going out: bypass Trier. Here's what doesn't make it into the history books about the specific moment the bypass order arrived. The order was sent at a point when the Third Army's forces were already engaging Trier. The gap between what SHAEF had calculated and what was happening on the ground was not a gap of days, but of hours, the kind of gap that a fast-moving army under an aggressive commander produces when it operates at a pace that outstrips the administrative cycle of the command structure above it. By the time the message reached Third Army headquarters and was placed in front of Patton, the question of whether to bypass Trier had already been answered by the men on the ground. The answer was no. They had gone in. And this is where it gets complicated, because what happened at Trier in early March of 1945 was not a reckless assault on a heavily defended city by a commander who had chosen to ignore orders. What happened was the specific logic of Patton's operational approach applied to a city that SHAEF had estimated by general principles and the Third Army had estimated by direct observation. The Third Army had taken Trier with 2 divisions, not 4, 2, half the force that SHAEF's planners had calculated as the minimum required. The assault had been mounted, the city had been taken, and the German defenses that the planners had assumed would require 4 divisions had been reduced by 2 divisions operating at the pace and the momentum that the Third Army had been building since August. This was not luck, and it was not recklessness. It was the specific product of a military force that had been optimized over 7 months for exactly this kind of fast-moving assault, commanded by a general who understood what his army could do, because he had been watching it do it for 7 months. Patton sat with the order to bypass the city he had already taken, and he composed 12 words. "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back?" Stay with me, because the 12 words are funnier than they are, and more serious than they are, simultaneously, and the combination is what makes them legendary. The humor is obvious. The image of the American army returning Trier to the Germans because SHAEF had not yet gotten around to ordering its capture is the specific kind of military absurdity that lands cleanly in any room. The bureaucratic machinery of the Allied command structure applied retroactively to a fait accompli, producing an instruction that the facts on the ground have already rendered meaningless. This is the kind of thing that has made soldiers laugh since there have been soldiers and orders. But underneath the humor is something more serious, and the something more serious is what elevated the reply from a good joke to a legend. Consider what the 12 words actually accomplished. They communicated 2 facts, 1 question and 1 implicit argument, in a sequence that required approximately 4 seconds to read. The 2 facts: the city has been taken, and it was taken with half the force your planners said it would require. The question: what do you want to do now? The implicit argument: the situation has changed and your order is no longer operative, and the only decision remaining is how to acknowledge this. Patton was not being insubordinate. He had taken a military objective. The question of whether he had been authorized to take it was, by the time the reply was sent, somewhat beside the point. The city was taken. The casualties had been paid. The men had done what soldiers do when commanded to do it, and the only remaining question was what to do with what they had produced. The 12 words posed that question to SHAEF in the only form in which it could meaningfully be posed. Do you want the thing we have, or do you want to undo it? Think about that for a second. The reply was not defiance. It was a request for instruction. A genuinely operational question about what SHAEF wanted to do now that the situation had changed. It was just that the question was posed in a way that made the absurdity of the only possible alternative, giving it back, absolutely vivid. See, what most folks don't realize is what the reply accomplished beyond making the entire communication staff of the Third Army briefly feel the specific satisfaction of watching a very good riposte go out over the wire. The reply forced the command structure to acknowledge a reality. By phrasing the question the way he phrased it, Patton made it impossible for SHAEF to respond in any way that preserved the fiction of the bypass order's continued relevance. You cannot respond to, "Do you want me to give it back?" by saying, "Yes." That answer is not available. It was never available. The only available answer was the one that acknowledged what the Third Army had done and incorporated it into the strategic picture going forward. The men who took Trier with 2 divisions included Private Raymond Farrell, 22 years old, from Allentown, Pennsylvania, who had been in the Third Army since the breakout at Avranches, and who was, in early March of 1945, one of the first Americans to pass through the Porta Nigra, the Black Gate, 1700 years old, the gate through which Roman legions and medieval armies and now American soldiers in the last spring of the last World War had passed. He had walked through a gate that Julius Caesar's soldiers had walked through, and that the armies of Charlemagne had walked through, which was the specific kind of thing that a 22-year-old private from Allentown did not fully process in the moment, but carried with him for the rest of his life. He would not know about the 12 words until later, when the story moved through the unit. He would tell it in Allentown in the years after the war, the way soldiers tell the best stories from their time, which is with the specific pleasure of someone who was present at the making of a sentence that lasted, who was, specifically, one of the 2-division reasons why the sentence was available to be made. The reply became legend because it was the precise intersection of Patton's competence and his personality. Neither one was sufficient alone. The competence was what made the reply possible. You can only say, "have taken Trier with 2 divisions," if you have actually taken Trier with 2 divisions. And the taking of it with 2 divisions, when SHAEF said it would take 4, is the military reality that the humor rests on. And the personality was what made it 11 words shorter than any other general would have used to say the same thing. Was Patton right to take Trier when ordered to bypass it, and to reply in the way he replied when the order arrived after the fact? Some would say no. That the order to bypass reflected legitimate strategic priorities, that Patton's habit of operating ahead of his orders was a recurring problem in Allied command coordination, and that the wit of the reply cannot substitute for the insubordination that produced the situation requiring it. Others would say exactly the opposite, that the Third Army's operational tempo was its principal strategic asset, that the orders above Patton were routinely catching up to realities he had already created, and that the 12 words were not insubordination, but the most efficient possible communication of a tactical fact to a strategic headquarters, followed by the only question that remained, asked with characteristic economy. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.